Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a high-stakes Supreme Court dispute from the Philippines, Talusan versus Tayag. And let me tell you, this is a terrifying, cautionary tale. It proves just how devastating a tiny bit of forgotten paperwork can actually be. Now, usually Supreme Court decisions, they're dense, super technical documents. But right at the start of this one, Justice Panganiban lays out a blunt, real-world warning. He literally writes the moral lessons of the case out loud. Register your purchases immediately and pay your taxes on time. You know, it's a rare, massive red flag written straight into a final ruling.
So, let's get into our first section, the costly property mistake.
The sheer financial shock here is just jarring. Okay, picture this. Back in 1981, the buyers, Antonio and Celia Talusan, paid 100,000 pesos for a Baguio City condo. But then, just 4 years later, that exact same property was auctioned off by the city for a tiny sum, just 4,400 pesos. Right? A massive real estate investment entirely wiped out by a minuscule unpaid tax bill. So how on earth does that happen? To figure that out, let's look at the timeline of a lost condo. All right, let's retrace their steps. In 1974, the original registered owner, a guy named Elias Imperial, emigrates to Australia. Fast forward to 1981, and the Talusans buy this Baguio condo from him for 100,000 pesos. But here is the absolute critical detail. They fail to register the deed of sale. Then, 4 years pass. In 1985, because real estate taxes haven't been paid, the Baguio City Treasurer auctions the property off to a new buyer, Hermenegildo Tayag, for just over 4,000 pesos. That covered the delinquent taxes and penalties. So, during that entire 4-year gap between buying the place and the auction, the buyers completely failed to file their paperwork with the government. Naturally, the Talusans were desperate, and they fought back hard in court. They argued that, hey, because they actually lived there, claiming actual, open, and continuous possession since 1981, they were the true owners. They argued that a 4,400 peso auction price was unconscionably low. They even offered to just reimburse the auction buyer, Mr. Tayag. But their absolute strongest argument, at least in their minds, was that the city never gave them any legal notice that taxes were owed or that an auction was even going to happen. Which brings up a really crucial question for us. If you buy a home and you're physically living inside it, wouldn't the government legally have to tell you before they auction it off? I mean, it seems like common sense that the people living in the condo should get the mail about the condo, right?
Well, that sparks the battle over legal notice.
To figure this out, the Supreme Court drew a very specific line between two types of legal proceedings. First, you have proceedings in rem, like initial land registration. These bind the whole world, meaning simply publishing a notice in a newspaper is generally enough. But tax sales? They're different. They are in personam. That means they strictly require personal notice sent directly to the specific delinquent taxpayer. Mere publication isn't enough. The city actually has to try to contact the taxpayer directly. But who exactly is the taxpayer? The law, specifically Presidential Decree 464, actually gives the treasurer a choice. They can send notices to the address on the tax rolls or to the taxpayer's known residence. In this case, the city treasurer used that discretion to send the notice to the original registered owner's permanent address down in Manila via registered mail. And the court pointed out that this made perfect sense. The Baguio condo was just a vacation home. It wasn't the registered permanent residence of the official owner. Which brings us to the next section, the power of property registration. The Supreme Court had to step in to definitively clarify who actually owns the property. And this highlights a really fascinating conflict, the gap between your private agreement and government recognition. Think about it. Even if you hold a signed deed of sale and you hand it over the cold hard cash, does the government actually know you exist? Well, the Property Registration Decree, specifically Presidential Decree 1529, has a very specific definition. It states that the act of registration shall be the operative act to convey or affect the land insofar as third persons are concerned. The operative act, that is the magic phrase, because until you literally march down to the Registry of Deeds and formally register your property, the land hasn't legally transferred in the eyes of the government, or frankly, anyone else who doesn't know about your private deal. So, because the Talusans never registered their deed,
Legally speaking, they were just unregistered buyers holding a private contract. As far as the city of Baguio was concerned, the original registered owner, Elias Imperial, was still the sole official taxpayer, and that meant he was the only person legally entitled to receive that auction notice. The buyers couldn't complain about being left in the dark because, under the law, they weren't the recognized taxpayers yet.
Let's move into our final section, the price of inaction.
The crucial point here revolves around the legal concept of leches. Basically, leches is the failure or neglect to assert a right for an unreasonable and unexplained length of time. In plain English, it means sleeping on your rights. The court applied this concept heavily here. They explained that the legal system simply cannot protect those who fail to protect themselves through the proper established channels.
Over 4 long years, the buyers made 3 fatal sequential errors. First, they failed to register the deed of sale after executing it in 1981. Second, they failed to legally move to consolidate their ownership of the title. And third, and perhaps most practically devastating, they just failed to pay the required real property taxes on the place they were living. You know, taking any one of these steps could have alerted the government to their presence and saved their entire investment. Ultimately, the Supreme Court completely validated the public auction. The new buyer, Hermenegildo Tayag, who scooped up the condo for a mere 4,400 pesos, was confirmed as the rightful legal owner. The original buyers literally lost everything. The ultimate takeaway of this whole explainer is perfectly summed up by the court's own words. They said, "The law helps the vigilant, but not those who sleep on their rights, for time is a means of obliterating actions." Basically, if you ignore your legal obligations to register your property and pay your taxes, the law is not going to bend over backward to save you from the consequences. So after seeing someone lose a 100,000 peso property over a tax bill of a few thousand pesos in an unregistered piece of paper, you really have to ask yourself, are you absolutely sure your own property registrations are in order? Is there a piece of unregistered paperwork sitting in a drawer somewhere right now, leaving your biggest investment completely vulnerable? It's a sobering thought for sure, and one well worth investigating. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.